September 1944. Fort Devon Station in Massachusetts, a moment where one woman's entire understanding of the world stood on the edge of transformation. A transport train carrying 47 German women prisoners of war rolled into the station with a metallic screech that tore through the platform, a sound that seemed to announce the end of everything they thought they knew. Greta Mueller pressed her face against the barred window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The Nazi propaganda machine had drilled terror into her bones for years. America, they said, was a wasteland, bombed-out cities where desperate people crawled through rubble like animals. Americans were savages, they told her, cruel men who would torture German women for sport, extracting revenge for every soldier lost. She had spent the entire Atlantic crossing bracing herself, mentally preparing for the absolute worst, steeling her mind against horrors she could barely imagine. Everything she'd been taught screamed that hell awaited her on this platform. Instead, she saw rolling Massachusetts hills dressed in the deep greens of early autumn. Buildings stood intact along neat streets where Americans in clean, well-made clothing moved with unhurried steps. Children's laughter drifted on the crisp September air from a nearby playground. Boys chasing each other around a swing set, their joy untouched by any shadow of war, a sound so normal it seemed almost unreal. But what happened next shattered everything. American soldiers approached the train car, their uniforms pressed and clean, their faces calm rather than cruel. What they carried made no sense. Not weapons, not chains. Simple metal cups filled with water. They offered the cups freely, pushing them through the bars with quiet gestures, without demands, without conditions. One young soldier spoke in careful, accented German, his voice gentle and almost apologetic. "You must be thirsty after such a long journey." Greta stared at that offered cup as though it might be poisoned. Her mind couldn't reconcile this simple mercy with everything she'd been taught about American brutality. Around her, the other women whispered in fearful German, their voices tight with suspicion and dread. "It's a trick," hissed Ingrid, a younger auxiliary who had clung to Nazi ideology even through their capture. "They fatten us up before the real torture begins." But Greta's throat burned with thirst. Her lips had cracked from the journey, and something in that soldier's eyes, a basic human kindness she hadn't expected to find anywhere in this country, made her reach out with trembling fingers. The water was cool and clean, tasting of nothing but relief and the strange shock of being treated like a human being. When the women moved through the camp's reception area, Greta braced herself for the violence she'd been promised would come. Instead, she faced Captain Margaret Walsh, an Irish-American nurse whose efficient manner masked something deeper, a genuine well of empathy. The captain spoke to them in careful German, her pronunciation a bit awkward, but her patience extraordinary. "You will receive 3 meals each day," she said, her words measured and kind. "Medical care when you need it. You may write letters to your families. No one will harm you here." The words felt surreal, like something from a dream Greta feared she'd wake from. She watched American personnel move through their duties with professional calm rather than savage hatred. These people seemed almost normal. That evening, lying on her narrow bunk in the women's barracks, Greta heard the whispered conversations of her fellow prisoners. Fear still dominated their voices. Years of propaganda aren't erased by a few hours of unexpected kindness. "Don't trust them," Ingrid whispered fiercely from the next bunk. "My brother warned me, Americans are clever with their cruelty. They make you hope before they destroy you." But it wasn't the whispered warnings that kept Greta awake. It was a letter that had arrived during processing, a letter from home that arrived with her mother's careful handwriting describing another bombing raid on Hamburg. Neighbors killed in their homes, buildings destroyed, ration cards providing barely enough to keep a person alive. The letter painted a picture of suffering so desperate it stood in stark contrast to the clean beds, adequate food, and basic human dignity Greta had already experienced in just one day. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She might actually be safer here as a prisoner in America than her family was as free citizens in Germany. The irony was devastating, the guilt crushing. While she slept on a real mattress and drank clean water freely offered, Her mother and sister huddled in bomb shelters, wondering if they would survive another night. This knowledge became her secret burden, a weight she carried alone in the darkness. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of American life, cars passing on nearby roads, a radio playing music somewhere in the camp, the easy laughter of off-duty soldiers. It was the sound of a world that still believed in tomorrow, where hope hadn't been rationed along with bread. 3 days into her imprisonment, Greta found herself assigned to work in the camp hospital alongside Captain Walsh. The assignment felt like stepping into a different world entirely, one where her medical training from the German Red Cross suddenly mattered more than her status as enemy prisoner. Within hours, Greta discovered herself doing what she'd always done best, caring for those who needed healing. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and something like hope, a sharp contrast to the makeshift medical stations she'd known in Germany where supplies were scarce and death was a frequent visitor. Here, medicine cabinets were well stocked, bandages were clean and plentiful, and patients received care based on need rather than political affiliation. On her third morning in the hospital, commotion erupted from the corner where several German children were housed, offspring of other female prisoners who had been captured with their mothers. A toddler, barely 2 years old, had developed a fever during the night and now wailed inconsolably despite his mother's desperate attempts to comfort him. Captain Walsh stood at the child's bedside, her medical expertise clear in her quick assessment, but her attempts to examine the boy were met with terrified screams. He had never seen an American up close before, and in his fevered state, her foreign appearance only amplified his fear. "He won't let me near him," Captain Walsh said quietly to Greta, genuine concern warring with frustration in her voice. "His temperature is dangerously high, but every time I approach—" Without thinking, Greta moved to the child's bedside and began singing softly in German, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her brother when he was small. The melody was simple, ancient, carrying the weight of countless mothers, soothing countless children across generations of human suffering and love. The effect was immediate. The toddler's cries softened to whimpers. His fevered eyes focused on Greta's face with a desperate trust that only children could offer. As she continued singing, she gently placed a cool cloth on his forehead, her movements practiced and tender. Within minutes, she was able to coax him to drink water and eventually to allow Captain Walsh to examine him properly. Captain Walsh watched this transformation in silence, and Greta could feel something shifting in the American woman's perception. For the first time since her arrival, Greta was being seen not as the enemy or even as the German prisoner, but simply as a woman who understood how to comfort a frightened child. "Your technique with children," Captain Walsh said later as they cleaned medical instruments together, her tone carefully neutral but curious. "You have experience." "I helped raise my younger sister," Greta replied in her halting English, surprised by her own willingness to share. "And in the hospital in Hamburg, we saw many children. War makes everyone afraid." The conversation hung between them, tentative but real. Two medical professionals finding common ground in their shared calling to heal. Meanwhile, beyond the hospital walls, Dorothy Hayes made her weekly delivery of fresh bread to the camp kitchen, a contract that provided steady income for her small cafe while supporting the war effort. She had deliberately avoided looking too closely at the German prisoners during her previous visits, unwilling to see faces that might complicate the clean lines of her grief over Jimmy's death. But on this particular morning, as she carried loaves through the kitchen entrance, movement through a window caught her attention. In the hospital ward beyond, she could see a German woman, young, with careful hands, tenderly bandaging another woman's infected wound. The prisoner's movements were gentle and professional, her focus entirely on easing her patient's discomfort. The scene struck Dorothy like a physical blow, not because it was shocking, but because it was achingly familiar. The same careful attention, the same instinctive compassion she had watched her son Jimmy display as a boy when he found injured birds or comforted younger children who had scraped their knees. The recognition was unwelcome and undeniable. This enemy prisoner possessed the same essential kindness that had defined her son's character. Dorothy forced herself to look away, but the image lingered as she completed her delivery and drove home through the familiar streets of her small Massachusetts town. How could the enemy show such tenderness? How could someone raised under Nazi ideology demonstrate the same gentle care that had made Jimmy special? That evening, Greta discovered something that would become a treasured secret. As she walked from the hospital back to the barracks, she spotted a small object glinting in the dust near the fence. An American penny, bright copper catching the last light of day. She picked it up with wonder, turning it over in her palm. In Germany, coins had been made of iron for years now, the copper needed for war machines. This tiny piece of American currency was crafted from real copper, solid and substantial in a way that spoke of abundance she had never imagined possible. It was such a small thing, this penny, but it represented something profound. A nation that could still afford to make its smallest coins from precious metal. A people who lived with plenty, even while fighting a global war. Greta slipped the penny into her pocket, where it would remain as a tangible reminder that everything she had been taught about American suffering and desperation was simply fundamentally untrue. The Red Cross notification arrived on a crisp October morning, announcing an official inspection of the prisoner of war camp that would include civilian observers from the local community. For Dorothy Hayes, the invitation to participate felt like both an opportunity and a trap. A chance to see firsthand how America was treating its German prisoners, but also a test of her patriotic resolve that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. She had spent 3 weeks trying to forget the image of the German woman tenderly caring for her fellow prisoner, but the memory persisted with stubborn clarity. Against her better judgment, against the voice in her head that sounded remarkably like her late husband reminding her that these people were responsible for Jimmy's death, Dorothy found herself signing up as a volunteer observer. The morning of the inspection dawned bright and cold, with a kind of autumn light that made everything appear sharply defined. Dorothy arrived at the camp gates wearing her best dress and the gold star pin that marked her as the mother of a fallen soldier, uncertain whether she was there to confirm her hatred or to challenge it. The Red Cross officials led the small group of civilians through various camp facilities, their tour carefully orchestrated to demonstrate America's adherence to international law regarding prisoner treatment. Dorothy dutifully observed the clean barracks, the adequate food preparation areas, the recreational facilities where German women could read books and write letters home. But it was in the makeshift classroom where everything shifted for Dorothy in ways she hadn't anticipated. A young American teacher named Miss Patterson stood at a blackboard covered with simple English words and their German translations. Before her, a dozen German women sat with notebooks and pencils, their faces bright with concentration as they practiced pronunciation. When Miss Patterson pointed to the word beautiful and asked for a volunteer to use it in a sentence, several hands shot up eagerly. "The autumn trees are beautiful here," said one prisoner in careful English, her accent thick, but her effort unmistakable. Miss Patterson smiled warmly and nodded. "Excellent, Maria. And yes, they are beautiful, aren't they? In Germany, do you have autumn colors like this?" What followed was a gentle discussion about seasonal changes, favorite colors, memories of home that had nothing to do with war or ideology, but everything to do with shared human experience. The German women laughed at their own pronunciation mistakes, helped each other with difficult words, and spoke with genuine appreciation about the kindness of their American teacher. Dorothy watched this exchange with growing unease. These weren't the hardened Nazi fanatics she had expected to see. They were women who seemed genuinely grateful for the opportunity to learn, who treated their American instructor with respect and warmth, who appeared to be normal, human. The truth was complicated. Dorothy's carefully constructed understanding of grief had rested on firm boundaries, good against evil, the innocent against those responsible, us against them. The revelation threatened to collapse everything she had built to make sense of her loss. 48 hours after the Red Cross representatives left Fort Devons, a piece of news arrived that would shake the fragile relationships beginning to take root in the camp. The letter came through official military channels and spread like fire through the barracks. The assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20th had failed. What followed was a sweeping crackdown across Germany, with investigations reaching far and wide. Word had arrived through a message smuggled in by another prisoner whose family maintained resistance connections. Some of the German women imprisoned at Fort Devons had relatives who might have been caught up in the investigations. Educators, administrative workers, cousins who had dared express reservations about the war. The Nazi response was ruthless. Mass arrests happened daily. Executions followed. The terror that gripped the camp was both visible and warranted. These women were already separated from their families by circumstance and capture. Now they faced the agonizing possibility that their loved ones were being interrogated, tortured, or executed for the crime of wanting Hitler defeated. The cruelty of the situation was staggering. They lived in relative safety under American guard while their families faced Nazi vengeance for simply hoping the war might end. Greta lay awake through the night, eyes fixed on the barracks ceiling, while women around her wept into their pillows. The American penny she kept in her pocket felt different now, no longer a symbol of American plenty, but a bitter reminder of the gulf between her own security and her family's mortal danger. Captain Walsh discovered her the next morning in the hospital supply closet, shoulders heaving with sobs she had fought to contain. They stood facing each other in silence for a moment, an American officer and a German prisoner, separated by language and nationality, yet bound together by the universal fear of losing family in wartime. "My mother," Greta whispered, her English broken and halting, her voice thick. "My sister. They might be." Captain Walsh glanced around quickly, then moved closer and rested a gentle hand on Greta's shoulder. A small act that technically violated regulations, but was fundamentally human. "I know," she said quietly. "I know what it means to be afraid for family." In that moment, despite the rules and regulations and the vast machinery of war standing between them as enemies, two women discovered they shared something far more powerful: the universal weight of love and fear and the helpless ache of being unable to protect the people who mattered most. The real change came on a grey November afternoon. Dorothy Hayes appeared at the camp gate carrying a worn leather-bound book. She had wrestled with the decision for weeks. The German-English dictionary had sat on her kitchen table like an accusation, there every morning as she drank her coffee alone. It had belonged to Jimmy. Before his deployment, he had bought it with his own money, because he believed that understanding your enemy was the first step toward understanding the world itself. "I'd like to see one of the German prisoners," Dorothy told the guard, her voice steadier than she felt. "The one who works in the hospital. I have something that might help her write letters home." The guard, who recognized Dorothy as both a regular visitor and a Gold Star mother, arranged the meeting. Within the hour, Dorothy sat across from Greta Mueller in a small visiting room, the dictionary positioned carefully between them like an offering. "Your son?" Greta asked in careful English, pointing to the name inscribed in faded pencil inside the front cover. "James Hayes." Dorothy nodded, struck by Greta's perception. Jimmy he was 20 years old when he fell at Normandy. The words settled between them, heavy with the weight of grief and the terrible arithmetic of war that takes young men from their mothers. Greta's eyes glistened. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice carrying a sorrow that belonged to no single nation. "My brother Karl, he died also. Not in battle, but from illness in the trenches, in Russia." What followed was a halting exchange in fragments of English and basic German, two languages struggling beneath the burden of shared loss. Karl had been 18, conscripted into a war he didn't comprehend, fighting for causes he had never chosen. Jimmy had volunteered the day after Pearl Harbor, driven by duty yet carrying an unshakable belief in human goodness that war never erased. As Greta spoke, Dorothy observed her carefully, the way her eyes creased when she smiled, the reverent manner in which she touched the dictionary as if it might break, the unconscious gesture toward a small scar on her left hand that told of countless hours spent caring for others. This wasn't the face of fanatical evil Dorothy had imagined. It was the face of someone who had lost as deeply as she had. Someone who understood that war claimed the best first. "He wrote to you?" Greta asked, noticing the stack of letters Dorothy had brought, Jimmy's handwriting visible through the thin envelopes. "Every week," Dorothy replied, her voice thick with memory. "Even at the end, even through difficulty. He always found something good to share." She withdrew one of his final letters, written just days before the Normandy invasion. With halting words and constant reference to the dictionary, she began translating passages for Greta. Jimmy had written about sharing his rations with a captured German prisoner they had found, about teaching him basic English phrases so he could ask for water and medical aid. about the peculiar experience of recognizing fear and pain in an enemy's eyes and discovering they were exactly the same as his own. Her son, Greta said slowly, searching for the right words. He saw person, not uniform. Dorothy nodded, tears flowing freely now. Yes, that was Jimmy. He saw people everywhere. The conversation stretched across 2 hours, moving from sorrow to remembrance to tentative hopes. Dorothy heard about Greta's dreams of teaching before the war, her love of music and gardening, her constant worry for her mother and younger sister in Hamburg. Greta learned that Dorothy had built her small cafe from nothing, that she had married young and lost her husband young, that Jimmy had been both her greatest joy and her deepest fear from birth. As the visiting period ended, Captain Walsh appeared in the doorway to escort Greta back to her ward. She had been observing from a distance, moved by the sight of 2 women, finding understanding across the enormous divide of war and nationality. "Mrs. Hayes," Captain Walsh said quietly, "thank you for coming. I think this meant everything." Dorothy stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting, her heart somehow heavier and lighter simultaneously. "The dictionary," she said to Greta, "keep it. Use it to write to your family. Jimmy would have wanted that." Greta accepted the book with trembling hands, comprehending the profundity of the gesture. "I will remember your son. I will remember your kindness." As Dorothy drove home through the familiar streets of her town, she carried something new, the beginning of an understanding that would overturn everything she believed about enemies and forgiveness, about honor and what it truly meant to honor her son's memory. The plan had been developing quietly over weeks, a cultural exchange where the German women would share traditional skills, wood carving, embroidery, bread making, things that transcended politics and national boundaries. Captain Walsh had championed the idea, convinced that human connection was the strongest path toward lasting peace. Dorothy had volunteered to help organize it, surprising herself with her genuine enthusiasm for something that months earlier would have horrified her. The preparations gave everyone a tangible sense of purpose and hope. Greta had been carving small wooden angels from scrap lumber, using tools borrowed from the maintenance shop. Her hands remembered her father's techniques from childhood, and each figure seemed to carry memories of a time before war when beauty could exist simply for itself. Then everything collapsed. The announcement came through military channels on a bitterly cold December morning. The cultural exchange was cancelled indefinitely. No reason was given, but everyone understood. Word of the planned event had leaked into the local community, and the reaction had been savage. "Fraternizing with Nazis while our boys are dying overseas," angry voices declared. The criticism spread through letters to the newspaper editor, heated discussions at town meetings, pointed questions directed at anyone connected to the camp who dared enter local shops. Dorothy bore the full force of the community's fury because her involvement was viewed as the ultimate betrayal. As a Gold Star mother, she was supposed to embody righteous anger, not what they saw as misguided compassion. Women at her church began avoiding her after services. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Old friendships cooled into distant politeness. Mrs. Henderson, whose husband sat on the town council, confronted Dorothy outside the post office with blazing righteousness. "How can you do this to Jimmy's memory?" she demanded, loud enough for the street to hear. "How can you smile at the people who killed our sons?" The words struck Dorothy like physical blows, each one aimed at her deepest fears. She had no response that would satisfy them or the growing crowd of onlookers nodding their stern approval. How could she explain that knowing Greta had actually brought her closer to Jimmy, not further away? How could she help them understand that compassion wasn't betrayal, that mercy didn't mean forgetting? The pressure intensified daily. Customers stopped coming to her cafe, driving further for their coffee rather than support her. Anonymous notes appeared under her door, questioning her loyalty and suggesting she move somewhere that would welcome her Nazi sympathies. The loneliness was crushing, made worse because Dorothy understood their anger even as it devastated her. Inside the camp, the cancellation sent waves of disappointment through the German women who had allowed themselves to hope for genuine human contact. Greta withdrew into herself. The wooden angels she had carved with such care now seemed like foolish fantasies. She stopped speaking English during her hospital work, reverting to German and communicating with Captain Walsh only through gestures and necessity. The tentative connections between guards and prisoners, between American staff and German women, began unraveling under community pressure. Captain Walsh found herself questioned by superior officers about whether her medical compassion had crossed into something inappropriate for wartime. Ingrid Weber, who had always viewed the growing friendships with suspicion, seized the moment as vindication. "You see," she told the other women after the evening meal, "they offer us kindness to weaken us, then destroy us when convenient. This is American mercy, a deception meant to break our spirits." Her words found willing listeners among women now feeling the sharp pain of betrayal. Those who had embraced English lessons and anticipated the cultural exchange began questioning whether they had been foolish to trust American promises of fair treatment. Greta lay in her narrow bunk that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if Ingrid had been right. Perhaps kindness was just another weapon, subtler than physical brutality, but ultimately more devastating because it required victims to open their hearts, to participate in their own undoing through the act of caring. The wooden angels remained in the box beneath her bed, now symbols of her own naivete. Outside, Massachusetts winter descended with particular harshness, cold seeping through the barracks walls, freezing not just the air but the very possibility of human connection. Everyone, prisoners and captors alike, was left wondering whether the brief warmth they had shared had been genuine or merely a dangerous illusion.